On February 5, 2025, President Trump signed a new executive order. This order, titled "Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports," sent shockwaves through the sporting world. It effectively bans transgender women from participating in women's sports at all levels. Supporters praise the protection of women's sports, while critics denounce it as discriminatory. The order raises questions about fairness, inclusion, and the definition of gender in sports. Its impact extends beyond sports, sparking conversations about equality and discrimination. The executive order's reach is extensive. It directs federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, to interpret Title IX regulations in a specific way. Title IX prohibits sex-based discrimination in education programs, including athletics. The order mandates that these agencies enforce Title IX rules to exclude transgender girls and women from female sports. State attorneys general are encouraged to file lawsuits against non-compliant schools and athletic associations. Schools risk losing federal funding if they allow transgender girls and women to participate in female sports. This financial pressure creates a strong incentive for institutions to adhere to the ban. President Trump defended the executive order as a necessary measure to protect the integrity of women's sports. He argues that allowing transgender women to compete creates an unfair advantage, citing their alleged biological differences. Trump and his supporters frame this as a matter of fairness for cisgender female athletes. He often cites cases of transgender women excelling in women's sports as evidence of an uneven playing field. Critics argue that Trump's rationale is flawed and based on misinformation. They point out that transgender women deserve the same opportunities to participate in sports as any other woman. The NCAA, the governing body for college athletics, now faces a critical decision. The White House expects full compliance with the executive order. NCAA President Charlie Baker has stated that the organization would follow federal law on this issue. The NCAA's response will have significant implications for collegiate sports. Schools, athletic conferences, and other governing bodies will be watching closely as they grapple with the implications of the executive order. Despite the intense focus on transgender athletes, data suggests that their participation in women's sports is extremely limited. NCAA President Charlie Baker testified that fewer than 10 out of 500,000 NCAA athletes were transgender. Critics argue that the executive order targets a minuscule population of athletes based on unfounded fears and stereotypes. Many transgender athletes face discrimination, harassment, and exclusion from a young age, making their path to athletic participation even more challenging. The executive order's impact extends beyond the athletic field. Universities and colleges that refuse to comply with the ban face severe consequences. They risk losing federal funding, which could devastate their academic programs and financial aid opportunities. Non-compliant institutions could also face lawsuits from cisgender female athletes. These legal battles could be costly and time-consuming, further straining university resources. Institutions must weigh their commitment to transgender students against the potential financial and legal ramifications of challenging the executive order. The executive order also has implications for international sports. It directs the Secretary of State to advocate for similar bans within the International Olympic Committee and other international sporting bodies. This directive reflects the Trump administration's desire to export its policies on transgender athletes to the global stage. The executive order also instructs the Department of Homeland Security to review visa policies for transgender athletes. Opposition to the executive order has been swift and vocal. Human rights organizations, LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, and many athletes and coaches have condemned the ban as discriminatory and harmful. Critics emphasize that transgender girls deserve the same opportunities to participate in sports as their cisgender peers. Being excluded from sports can have a devastating impact on self-esteem, social development, and mental health. The White House has defended the executive order, maintaining that it is not intended to enforce sex stereotypes, but rather to protect women's sports. They argue that allowing transgender women to compete undermines fairness. The White House has suggested exploring alternative solutions such as creating co-ed categories in certain sports. Critics argue that this suggestion is impractical and fails to address the fundamental issue of transgender athletes' right to compete in accordance with their gender identity. This executive order is not an isolated incident. It follows a pattern of policies enacted by the Trump administration targeting transgender rights. Critics argue that these actions are discriminatory and harmful. The cumulative impact of these policies creates a climate of fear and uncertainty for transgender individuals and their families. The fight over transgender rights is far from over, and this executive order is just the latest battle in a much larger war.